what we are about to discuss next is we're talking about Holocaust Memorial Day. And many years ago, when I was with Channel Islam International, I had the opportunity of interviewing a very elderly couple, a Jewish couple, and they must have been close to their 80s, I think, or just over 80, if my memory serves me right. And these were Holocaust survivors. And this was actually an eye opener for me sitting in the studio with these elderly people and really horrified at what they had actually experienced and what they had gone through. And as we observe Holocaust Memorial Day and remembrance of the Holocaust, it is clear that the objectives are one where it serves as a stark reminder and a warning against mass violence and dehumanization of a section of people. And when we look at 2026 as we speak right now, and when one looks at the Holocaust that are taking place, the genocide that is taking place, and this raises the question, how do we reconcile that moral legacy with the images that we see today in the world and in particular Gaza in the last 2 years? And this is the reason why we are talking with anti-Zionist Jewish South African Paul Hendler. Paul, good morning to you. Welcome to the show. And as always, an absolute pleasure having you with us here on Salam Media.
Thank you, Inayat, and I return the compliment. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, Paul, as I mentioned right at the outset, I had this interview many years ago with Holocaust survivors and clearly horrified, shocking. And year after year, we have Holocaust Memorial Day. And when one looks at, you know, uh, the slogan, never again, never again will this happen, yet we see it happening over and over again.
Yeah, yeah, it's true, and it's a commentary on the I don't know how to put it, but on the ineffectiveness of creating a a world where societies are structured in such a way and have the values imbued in them that we can give reality to this idea of never again anywhere for anyone.
Yes. Also, Paul, I think, obviously this is creates a label, and also when one looks at the identity, because what happens, this impacts on the identity of a section of people. And again, this has got absolutely nothing to do with people who subscribe to a religion, to subscribe to an ideology, for example, the Jewish religion and the ideology. But again, when you have actions taken by individuals and by certain groups, for example, when we know the Zionists, Zionism in itself is an ideology, because right across the entire world on this day where they are remembering or the Holocaust, many Jewish people worldwide are not happy with what Netanyahu and his government are doing, and those that are promoting Zionism.
No, you're quite right. I'm one of those people. Sadly, amongst the amongst the leadership of the Jewish community in South Africa, there's quite a, a consensus to support the state of Israel, regardless of which government's in power, and to support it as a bulwark against anti-Semitism, and to see the resistance to Zionist colonization as anti-Semitic. Okay, and so we go from there to the genocide being committed by a self-proclaimed Jewish state against a group of people, the Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but its most extreme form is there, but also there are incidents of that happening on the West Bank as we speak. Um, and I suppose one needs to, in a way, just take a step back and reflect the way my colleague Stephen Friedman did in his book Good Jew, Bad Jew, on how things have become inverted, from the 1940s, the period you're referring to, and what this day is a commemoration of, how they've become inverted from being people being a victim um, into being a perpetrator.
Yes,
And
Paul.
yeah, I think there's a whole lot of issues around there which we could talk about, but obviously I'm guided by where you want to focus this chat.
Yes, Paul. In fact, where I'd like to actually focus is, although this is a commemoration and we go back into history and memory, but the key issue is lessons that have been learned, or it does appear from what we've seen the last few years in Gaza as well, the consequences of dehumanization, collective punishment, ethnic cleansing. Now, these were all lessons that, should have been learned emanating from the Holocaust, the horrific Holocaust that had taken place. And yeah, again, what does this say about what has been taking place in Gaza? You mentioned the West Bank as well, and how poorly these lessons have been absorbed in this day and age.
Yeah, look, I think let's get very specific here because we're talking about the state of Israel and we're talking about it acting allegedly in the name of Jews worldwide to protect them against such things ever happening again, and yet perpetrating the same types of deeds on other victims. And what is clear is that they've quite consciously um, used certain definitions of what it means to be Judeophobic. I use the word Judeophobia rather than anti-Semitism because there are many people in West Asia who are Semites and are not Jewish, and so you have, um, for example, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance (IHRA), which has its own definition and examples of um, what Judeophobia is. And you have another one called the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which similarly looks at what it means to be Judeophobic. Because to be Islamophobic, Judeophobic, Slavophobic against the Russians is all part of the mentality, the precondition mentality, if I can put it that way, uh, for people to go and perpetrate barbarous deeds. And why I'm mentioning these two definitions, and I've recently come across a third one called the Lexis, is that there's a very conscious articulation of this within the Zionist community itself, and there's a very particular relationship between um, the Holocaust, or I call it the German genocide of the Jews, and I'll tell you why. I prefer that in a moment. There's a very particular articulation between that event and the and what it means to be Judeophobic, particularly when you are a critic of Israel in their minds. Okay, and so they take any attempt to question what happened in the Holocaust, in the German genocide, as a sign of um, Judeophobia. They take any question to suggest or to investigate possible collaboration between Zionists in the 1930s and 40s and the National Socialist regime as a sign of Judeophobia. They take any questioning of, what actually happened, as I said, as a sign of that, and they take any attempt to relate what happened there to what happened in places under colonialism, in places like German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, in our own country, if we go back to the Dutch colonization, where there were cases of genocide also, they take all that as a sign of Judeophobia. And why do they do that? Because they assume that the genocide of the Jews by the Germans is the preeminent genocide. And any comparison devalues this. And I've actually heard many decades ago a speaker at a commemoration of this day out in the Jewish cemetery at Pinelands in the Cape actually say that when Bishop Tutu, at the time, 1989, you remember we were on the verge of change then, and there were protest marches in which the Arch played quite a leading role, in which he called apartheid one of the worst crimes since the Nazi genocide. And that was called out as devaluing our genocide by the Germans, because that's the preeminent one. And it was stated as much by Ben Gurion in 1952. And I won't go into all those details to save time, but the point I want to make is that part of the problem of these human rights violations and genocidal ones too, continuing. I mean, there's the Congo, there's Sudan recently, and in the recent past also. And there's the Rohingya in Myanmar, and we could go on to others, I guess. But part of the problem is that we are enthralled to a Western supported Zionist narrative that the Jews are the preeminent victims, and the genocide of the Jews is the sort of benchmark against which you judge everything else. And how do we address this? I think we address it by saying no, we're not preeminent. We are all part of this world. We are all victims and perpetrators in whatever circumstances we find ourselves, and we need to learn the lessons by looking at, what was done in German Southwest Africa at the time, and what was done in other genocides. I think of the genocide of the Amakosa in the Seelveld by a British Army officer after whom Grahamstown was named. And there's a very interesting book by an author called Michael Rothberg called Multidirectional Memory, in which he sets out to do exactly that. And he goes back into the history of the American Civil Rights Movement, and even before that, the Black American activists who were struggling for freedom before the war, and their thoughts on Du Bois, Haïm Césaire, and their thoughts on the fact that no suffering is preeminent, and that we need to learn from each other. And his book is in fact called Multidirectional Memory, to emphasize that point.
Yes, Paul. But also, I think, it does appear as if these lessons have not been learned because, you speak about whether it's colonialism, whether we're talking about imperialism as well. The international community has not learned this lesson. And here we're talking about international complicity in a lot of these genocides that have taken place that you referred to as well. And especially on a day like this, when we're talking about the commemoration of the Holocaust, this is what we should be actually be talking about. Yes, we need to obviously remember, we need to honor the suffering of the Jewish people at that point in time. But again, the world at this point in time and on a day like this should actually be talking and mainly talking about standing up firmly against the atrocities that are still being committed in this world.
Yeah, no, 100%. And some of my colleagues at the Palestine Solidarity Campaign Cape Town have held regular vigils outside the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center, asking for them to add the Holocaust in Gaza at the moment to their list, and they're also raising the Sudan situation and the Eastern DRC genocides that have been going there. There have been many genocidal moments there over the last 20 years, in fact. So I think the world, the big powers in the world have not learned this. I mean, at the moment, you have, I see Vladimir Putin, who's a major opponent of US NATO expansion, you possibly call it colonialism in Eastern Europe, getting himself onto the board of governors as a shareholder that's going to allegedly reconstruct Gaza. I also see he met the ex-Al Qaeda ISIS current leader of Syria in Moscow the other day. So I think it's really up to people in outside of these state structures, and even the less powerful states like our own country. It's up to us on mediums like yours, which is very valuable, and the various solidarity organizations on Palestine, but also other organizations that are struggling for a understanding of South African history and its genocide of the first people here, to actually continually challenge these narratives in the public domain. And yes, we are doing it already. Yes, it's happening on a small scale, but Rome wasn't built in a day, and it starts small. But when you talk to activists at the grassroots and you at protest meetings with other people, you get a sense of how receptive people are to hearing this because of their own experience of being victims currently in South Africa, economically and socially. Not necessarily, there's not necessarily genocide going on in South Africa at all. There's a narrative about genocide which has been weaponized by certain groups and by Trump, but that's a whole different issue. But what I'm trying to say is I think it's outside of state structures and alternative media like yourselves, where we can actually have the time to talk to people and to put a different narrative out there, and to struggle and organize to make that narrative ultimately hegemonic, so that we do change the world, and it's beyond our control as individuals. But I think history teaches us that when we at breaking points, like we are now, people start moving very fast and grasping what the issues actually are. So, to quote Gramsci, my spirit is optimistic about that, despite my intellectual pessimism at times.
Yes, Paul, and also I think finally, when we're talking about changing the world as well, it does require moral authority, but also moral consistency, which is absolutely critical because there needs to be this consistent opposition to all forms of mass killing, oppression, regardless who commits these crimes. And also, as we reflect in the past, we need to think of the future as well, because again, future generations will judge us for what we are seeing today.
Yeah, no, I think the future is even more risky than than what the past has been, because we are sitting on the edge of a world war, and unlike 1914 and 1939, there are enough weapons of mass destruction in the Russian and the US side to end everything, ecocide, which would be the ultimate type of multiple genocide. So I think there's a lot to learn from how we see the other, and we've got to keep on having these conversations and getting the outreach to as many people as possible.
Well, thank you for that, Paul. And as always, an absolute pleasure having you with us right here on Salam Media. Please take care and please stay blessed.
Thank you. Stay.
Paul Hendler with us this morning. And with that, we're going to go for a break, and we will obviously end off with the this morning's edition of Fired Up with Hafiz Imran Chunara, CEO of Africa Muslims Agency and also Personal Excellence Mentor.